Всіх ще раз вітаю, дорогі колеги.
Hello everyone again, dear colleagues. Welcome, and we are going to start our third cluster. I actually feel that we started today by talking a lot about the interaction with considering the experience of survivors when we speak about creation of programs, including reparation programs for survivors of CRSV. And during this hour and a half, we have an opportunity to speak directly about this subject, to highlight once again how important it is to consider the experience of survivors of sexual violence, and also to think what steps we should take, what specific steps we must consider to take into account the voices of survivors in Ukraine and overall. First of all, I would like to thank today's speakers for their interest in this subject. And I would encourage everyone to join us. We have actually quite a cozy atmosphere in this room. So I encourage you to ask questions. We will definitely have time to ask the questions that you are interested in. So do please take notes of your questions, and we will absolutely have an opportunity to hear your responses. Another organizational point. As far as I see, everyone has headphones. We will have simultaneous interpretation into English and into Ukrainian, so I encourage you to use this if you have the need. I will remind you that my name is Viktoriia Karpa. I'm a lawyer and head of the Center JurFem Education, and today I will be moderating this cluster together with Dominique Vidale-Plaza, who is Senior Program Manager, Holistic Care at the Dr. Denis Mukwege Foundation. So at this point, over to Dominique.
As Viktoriia mentioned, today's cluster is really about how we can enhance survivor participation in all processes in response to CRSV, conflict-related sexual violence, and particularly in reparations. The specific objectives of today's cluster is to discuss with our esteemed panelists how we can better include survivors in the documentation of policies and the development of policies, how we can ensure intersectionality in this work with survivors of CRSV, and how we can best take into account the specific needs and priorities of women, men, boys, girls, and all of these individuals in different processes related to CRSV, and finally, how we can work with children who are born as a result of CRSV or who are otherwise affected by CRSV. So today on our panel, we have Ms. Uliana Tokareva, who is the Deputy Minister of Social Policy, Mihailo Spasov, who is a representative of the Secretariat of the Ukrainian Ombudsman, Dr. Kim Seelinger, who is the Senior Coordinator of the Office of the Prosecutor for Gender-Based Crimes and Crimes Against Children at the International Criminal Court, Veronika Plotnikova, the Head of the Coordination Center for the Support of Survivors and Witnesses of the Office of the Prosecutor General and Human Rights in Ukraine, Igor Svetkovsky, an expert at the International Organization for Migration on reparations, Oleksiy Sivak, a representative of the Network of Men who have survived torture, Charu Lata Hogg, the Executive Director of the International Organization All Survivors Project, and Olena Lazareva, who is a representative of SEMA Ukraine. Let's give them a warm welcome, and I give the floor to Viktoriia.
Дякую велике, Домінік. Тоді будемо розпочати насправді і почну.
Thank you, Dominique, and I will start by pointing out that everyone probably heard the principle, nothing for us without us. And actually, this principle is defining when we speak about the establishment of services and programs for survivors. So my first question will be to Uliana about how this principle of nothing for us without us is implemented in Ukraine today, how it is provided, so that the experience of survivors would be taken into account in such programs. I would be thankful if you could share your thoughts and ideas how to implement this. Thank you and welcome everyone. I'm very happy that so many people decided to attend this event, because we are speaking about very specific steps that must be taken by the government of Ukraine, particularly as designated minister, Minister of Social Policy, and by stakeholders, including NGOs, local self-government and international organizations.
Я би почала розмову про те, що
Here I would start the conversation by saying that we have to respond to the national level through several serious tools. And one of such tools is actually the regulatory framework, which would provide the basis for important changes in the survivor support system. For example, the changes that have taken place in the update of the National Agenda 1325 Women and Peace Security added another target group of this plan, women, but okay, not only women, people who were affected by CRSV. This is very important because we formed a framework in which we could have a dialogue between various sectors, between various levels, including engagement of individuals who were affected by CRSV. It is very important for us that such interaction issues are not only taken into account in legislation, but also that the voices of people affected by CRSV should be heard at national platforms and international ones. And for the second year now, just in a few days, the Ukrainian delegation will participate in the annual event in New York. It is the Committee on the Situation with Women's Rights, and the members of this delegation include representatives of communities who represent the interest of survivors of CRSV. This is another important step that allows us to develop a dialogue. Another step that is currently being done is asking the opinion of survivors of CRSV. And with the support of UN Women, in 2023 we held a large-scale research with almost 3,000 participants. I'm sorry, I have my notes here, so I will look into my cheat sheet. This research was dedicated to the impact of security challenges on women, men, boys, girls, taking into account their age, their place of residence, and other social factors during Russia's full-scale invasion into Ukraine. Actually, there are very interesting insights here that affect decision-making at the national level. Among those that we surveyed, there are those who were affected by CRSV. And actually, 3% of the population knows somebody who was affected by CRSV. This is very important information. That is, we definitely understand that survivors do share information with their loved ones, with their family members, and this gives us an opportunity to find additional entry points for important support programs. Another important aspect of information for us was that 89% of the population know where they can go if a person was affected by gender-based violence or CRSV. I didn't believe these figures first. 89%, that's just too strange. But then when looking at the results, we saw that people know whom they can approach as institutions. They know that there are hotlines for survivors. That they know they can approach the police. They know of social services or NGOs that work with it. But when it comes to specific places, when we asked them where they can find this phone number, this was slightly more challenging for them. Another important point that we found was that the closer we get to the front line, the less information people can have about where they can turn. And this is very important to understand when we are building dialogue on the local or national level. We shouldn't forget to engage NGOs or communities representing the interests of survivors, local social services, to take into account the needs of everyone. Together with the government commissioner on gender equality and with designated ministries, we have been working for several months in order to introduce approaches of gender mainstreaming in the design of national solutions on recovery. And the use of such approaches is also impossible without engaging target groups for whom these recovery processes are meant. So this is quite a broad platform so that we can work. And here I would like to provide an example of how such dialogue processes are supported. For instance, I know that we have representatives of Ukrainian Women's Fund here, and there was this very good thing recently, oh yeah, I see Olesya, right? The development of training programs at the local level to support survivors of CRSV, and NGOs that directly work with survivors or provide services to survivors were directly involved in the development. This is also an important step so that such dialogues can take place. Thank you. Thank you very much. It seems to me that the most frequent thing that you mentioned in your presentation, which is defining for today's cluster and for a subject in general, is dialogue, right? Because this dialogue has to take place either in the context of communications between the government and NGOs with survivors, for instance. This dialogue has to take place in terms of engaging and hearing the voices of survivors. So thank you very much for sharing those steps, for mentioning that report. I will have a slide question here. Can we read this report? That's a good question. It will be available in March later. Now it is getting through final stages of design, but I think we will dedicate an additional event to this report so that as many people as possible can learn about this. In any case, thank you very much for sharing this information with us, even though the report is not yet finalized, that we can draw conclusions from this and build on it. And in the context of dialogue, I also have a question about the dialogue of survivors with NGOs that represent the interest of survivors, with NGOs that provide services to survivors and envision certain challenges. I'm interested in the opinion of the Office of the Government Commissioner, Mikhailo, and I know that the office monitors the adherence to human rights, and there are my colleagues from JurFem here who can share that when we held trainings for multidisciplinary groups, your colleagues from the regions shared that survivors do have different questions. They turn to you, and they are survivors of different crimes, including CRSV. Could you share your experience, the needs that your office hears, and how you respond to them? Thank you. First of all, I would like to welcome everyone who found the time. I would like to thank for the opportunity to speak before you today. It is absolutely impossible to overestimate the importance of this event, because before, this subject was slightly impossible to discuss publicly, not only for survivors. Even the government didn't want to discuss the subject. So it is very good that we actually started speaking about this, that we started engaging international stakeholders in this, that we started drawing attention of everyone. Following up with the answer to your question, indeed, the Office of the Government Commissioner regularly monitors the adherence of to human rights and freedoms in all sectors, including CRSV, and unfortunately this monitoring mostly consists of of comparing the measures that are included in legislation and how the government actually implements them. And one problem that we regularly face is that there is no legislative regulation of the notion of CRSV. There is no designated legislation that would work specifically with this subject. We heard multiple times that indeed, we can bring the guilty to liability, we can prosecute them, we can carry out investigative action, but when we speak of a remedy, when we speak of restoring the rights of individuals who were affected, there is an issue in terms of the legislation here. In terms of that, I would like to point out the legislative initiatives that already exist today in the Ukrainian parliament waiting to be approved. This includes draft law 10132 on the status of individuals affected by sexual violence and on urgent interim reparations. Among other things, this draft law prescribes the creation of register of survivors, and I think this is an urgent, critical legislative initiative, since this will be an important step towards prosecuting the guilty, but also to make sure that everyone who was affected, every survivor of sexual violence, could get access to remedy. As for the role of the government commissioner and the office in terms of responding to CRSV, I guess I would say that this is mostly about mediation, about carrying out control over assistance provided to survivors. This is an issue of referral, as you said yourselves, referral primarily in the regions which are either close to the sites of those war crimes or that encounter individuals who were affected by CRSV. In this context, we should say that the Office of the Government Commissioner, even when there was no legislative database for this, started working since the beginning of the full-scale invasion to identify individuals who suffered human trafficking. Of course, we cannot compare these two crimes, human trafficking and conflict-related sexual violence, but we understand well on the regional level, on the central level, that establishment of this specific status of a survivor will help us provide assistance to everyone affected. And this status, this very action will guarantee further positive steps for such individuals. The positive steps include the fact that I think in May 2022 there was a framework program between the government of Ukraine, represented by Olga Stefanishina, and the UN to counteract CRSV. Members of the working group on this program actually approved the action plan to implement this program, and the government commissioner is also among the responsible agencies for this plan. There is constantly monitoring of its implementation, particularly in the regional aspect. We consider a lot the role of local authorities, local self-government. We are working with preparation of information materials that are shared with them for further distribution in the regions. In addition, to draw attention to the subject, in autumn last year, together with the Office of the Vice Prime Minister, with the NGO experts, together with UNFPA, we organized a forum on CRSV issues. The forum was about establishing contact with regional representatives and establishing hubs to help survivors. And it is hard to overestimate the importance of this event, like I said, because it is regional offices that have the first contact, the first response to affected individuals. And we understand that this first contact should be should include way more training than for any other points of contact, I guess, because it is this first step that determines what happens next. It should also be noted that we regularly work with civil society, with civil society organizations. We have an expert council in the government commissioner office. We have representatives of almost all sectors of human rights law there. And I should point out here a project that was initiated to help survivors of sexual violence. And as part of cooperation with this project, we also constantly inform survivors of the remedy mechanisms that are available to them today here. In addition, during the main panel, it was mentioned multiple times that there is a pilot project on reparations that is currently being initiated. I am part of the supervisory board as a representative of the Government Commissioner Office, and I believe that while we cannot initiate this on the legislative level due to some or other political aspects, I think that such projects, such interim reparations, will also assist with remedy to survivors. Finally, I want to point out that the work of the Government Commissioner's Office, the work of every one of us, is based on the principles of confidentiality. This is probably the main component in the difficult subject of CRSV. We do not seek to prosecute the guilty primarily. The main thing is to assist the survivor. And despite that, we communicate with law enforcement agencies, but we only do that with consent of the survivor of sexual violence. And that is why I encourage representatives of civil society to promote taking the avenue of communication with the Government Commissioner's Office, because we all understand how to communicate with this individual, how to refer them further, and how to help them get remedies when the guilty are brought to justice. Thank you very much. Thank you. And actually, thank you for pointing out this highly important role of the Government Commission in terms of referral of survivors, particularly to ensure this referral should be confidential, should be safe for people, and how the synergy and cooperation are important here. Because it is experience that helps you refer people to the right places. You pointed out that maybe there is practice sometimes that is ahead of legislation, but I think practice is defining in terms of sensitivity of people who work with survivors and how sensitively and safely the person will be referred further so they can obtain additional assistance. My colleagues and I will discuss this issue further, but now I would like to give the floor to Dominique.
Viktoriia. The International Criminal Court on an international level plays a key role in developing policy and prosecuting gender-based crimes. The ICC Trust Fund for Victims also plays a key role in ensuring reparations and assistance for victims of these crimes, and specifically of conflict-related sexual violence crimes. To Dr. Seelinger, to Kim, can you share with us a bit about the role of the ICC in the prosecution of CRSV, how you ensure survivor participation and intersectionality in these processes, and what is the role of the prosecutor's office? I think it should be on. Can you hear me all right? No, okay.
Thank you, Dominique, and thank you for having me. And And thank you for the interpreter. You've been doing an incredible job. Thank you for enabling us to follow along in this discussion. My name is Kim Thuy Seelinger, and the last time I was in Ukraine, I was the prosecutor's special advisor on sexual violence and conflict. And in September, I resigned from that position to come in to staff and serve as the senior coordinator for gender-based crimes and crimes against and affecting children. So I am happy to share with you a little bit more of an inside view now that I'm in the ICC as staff about how we look at the question of intersectionality and reparations and the extent to which we have been successful and maybe have still some challenges in engaging survivors directly in this work. So I don't know exactly how it works in Ukraine just now. I know many of the details are being sorted out. For us at the International Criminal Court, reparations can only happen in the case of a conviction, right? So it is downstream from the trial and all the preparation for the trial. And so in that way, the Office of the Prosecutor, where I work, we are a bit upstream from the reparations step. But everything that we do paves the way for the possibility of reparations, right? And so in that way, we do have a role. It's limited. But let me break down a few aspects of our work in the limited time that we have. So very quickly, maybe I'll start with where we are in terms of reparations at the ICC in case this is helpful, because there are some aspects of our reparations orders that have happened recently that are very relevant to the question of intersectionality and inclusion of reparations for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And then I'll ask you to go upstream with me a little bit to the work of the Office of the Prosecutor so that you can see what happened or what we're trying to do to get us to that point going forward, okay? All right, so because we have such limited time, I won't go through all of the reparations orders in the history of the court, but there are a few that are quite recent that might be of interest to you and relevant in the Ukraine context. Last year, we finally had a reparations order confirmed in the case in Tanganda. This was a case relevant to the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this, as you might know, this was an interesting case because one of the groups of direct victims in the case were actually girl soldiers who were in Taganda's own forces. So this was a groundbreaking decision in a way, showing that commanders can be held liable for crimes committed against members of their own forces, which we haven't seen before. In this case, we had direct victims identified. There were victims of the attack who were civilians, but then also the child soldiers, and then also children who were born out of rape and sexual slavery in the context of this situation. We had convictions for rape and sexual slavery as part of the overall case. We also had indirect victims who became eligible for reparations. And by indirect victims, we mean close family and others who were harmed personally as a result of the harm suffered by direct victims. So often these are family members. And this also means that these are children who were born of the rape their mothers experienced. Right? Now, in this case, you see intersectional gender competent analysis in the design of the reparations because it looked at the age of the victims, plus their gender, and also in some cases their socioeconomic situation. Because what we saw in these facts, many children were recruited because their families had nothing else to contribute to the armed group. And so they were pressured to give up their children instead. So in this way, intersectionality works because it combined age, gender, and sometimes class or socioeconomic status. It, of course, didn't matter that some of the victims were combatants or in part of the unit because they're children, and so they are automatically protected from rape and sexual slavery. So I won't go on about that case, but you'll see, if you're interested, that this led to an approval of a reparations award of, I think this one was $30 million. This was $30 million for actually victims in this case that was distributed among different groups of direct and indirect victims and survivors. So I use the term victims here because this is in our legal framework. This is what makes someone eligible for reparations in the way it's worded in the ICC. I know there's a debate about terminology. Our position and our policy is we can use victims and survivors depending on what we're instructed by the groups themselves. If someone prefers one term over the other, we must respect that. And also, we can't avoid the word victims because many people don't survive, and they also need to be included in the reparations and injustice efforts, even if they're not still alive, right? So just a side note from the conversation earlier this morning. More recently, we had a reparations order just last month, at the end of February. This was in the Ongwen case, which was a case out of Uganda. And just briefly here, this was an award, this was our largest reparations award to date, 52 million euros in reparations. The direct victims include victims of gender-based crimes, children born of these crimes, former child soldiers, and their communities, and the children of the direct victims. So this allows for some awards for transgenerational harm, right? And in addition to the collective and community-based reparations, there was an order for payment of 750 euros to each individual victim too, which is a combination of collective and individual reparations. Of course, the defendant, the convicted person in this case, is indigent. He doesn't have this kind of money. None of us have this kind of money. So in this case, the court has ordered the ICC's Trust Fund for Victims to try to find supplemental sources of resources from member states, for example, to pay out as much as is possible. And this may not happen all at the same time. So this is the work largely of the Trust Fund for Victims. This is not the work of my office to implement and design these reparations orders. So let me quickly just run to what the Office of the Prosecutor does. So remember, this is upstream. None of these reparations I just described is possible unless there's a conviction. To get to the conviction, we have to have effective investigation and prosecution of all of these crimes, including conflict-related sexual violence. And I know since time is very limited, let me just mention a few quick things here. Upstream of our investigation and our prosecution, our trial work, we have to have policies, we have to have positions about how we do this work. And so one thing that I would mention is we have a number of relevant policies. I don't think they're translated into Ukrainian yet, but I'm going to be asking the prosecutor if we can do this to make them more available to you here. 2022, the office issued the policy on the crime of gender persecution. And then last year, I led in the development and the launch of a policy on gender-based crimes and also a policy on children. All of these policies, I think, are relevant in the Ukraine case. What I would say at the outset, in the development of those policies, Dominique asked, to what extent were survivors involved in the development? I will only speak for the policies that I led on, or co-led on in the children's case. We had a number of consultations throughout the year 2023 with national authorities, with civil society organizations, and also with victims and survivors and their associations. And some of them happened in group settings, some of them were bilateral. And we tried to gather these inputs, both through in writing and in person and in Zoom conversations or Teams conversations, and reflect the perspectives of these different actors in the development and the drafting of the policies. So that was all launched in December. I'm now in the process of implementing these policies, which means creating the tools. What are the practice tools that the office, our investigators, our analysts, our prosecutors need to have so that they actually do what the policy instructs them to do? And what I'm hoping to do as we move through this in 2024 is create advisory groups that will also include those stakeholders to just, where we can share what we're working on in terms of internal practice tools, get feedback on those things. So this will happen in different ways. A lot of our internal guidance we can't make public for many reasons, but there are aspects of it and principles in it that we can actually actively consult with survivors on. And I think that this is key because for inclusive and transformative reparations, we do need to have an intersectional lens. And this means that often the reparations orders are organized by category of crime and category of victim or survivor, right? But within those groups, there's so much diversity. The same act, say for example, rape in detention, that same act can be committed for different reasons based on the intersectionality of different people in that facility. It can have different meaning, it can have different impacts, and unless we then disaggregate in these different groups, we won't understand which reparations are most necessary for different types of individuals who are affected by the same act. So it is, I think, our obligation as OTP to put as much of that nuance and detail into our filings so that by the time, if there is a conviction, the victims and survivors can actually come forward because they see themselves in the facts, and they will be more easily included in the reparations orders. So we have to plant the seed in the evidence and our filings, look at different impact of different types of people, so that makes it easier for them to be included at an eventual reparations stage. And that's the responsibility of the Office of the Prosecutor in paving that way for later reparations. There's a lot more I would love to say to you, but I know time is short, so I'll pass it on. But thank you very much for having me.
Дякую велике, Кім.
Thank you very much, Kim. I actually have just a brief comment here. First of all, thank you very much for mentioning the program document in terms of gender-based persecution and the experience of the ICC in terms of consulting with civil society organizations. But I have good news for those who are present, is that JurFem has prepared a translation of the program document into Ukrainian. It is available on the JurFem website. This is the policy on the crime of gender persecution. So yes, indeed, you can see it in Ukrainian on the JurFem website. Thank you.
This is a great, already a great segue, I think, because what you've just shared with us is that JurFem has already proceeded with these translations. The role of civil society is really quite key in ensuring that these policy documents that are developed on an international or regional level become more accessible on the national level and also in communities. So the next question that we have is for Veronica, actually, who can maybe share with us a bit how you, as the head of the Coordination Center for the Support of Survivors and Witnesses and within the Office of the Prosecutor General, how do you collaborate with civil society organizations? And how do you think this collaboration affects survivor participation?
Доброго дня.
Hello, everyone. I am happy to have this opportunity to speak with the colleagues. Unfortunately, this topic will remain with us for a long time. This is about creating an ecosystem of survivors and witnesses. The story that we are talking about, the story of dialogue, is that no one can make decisions instead of survivors, instead of people affected by things that's probably the worst things in their lives. And in fact, this is a story of how government agencies should do no harm, but rather do good. For us, it is essential to be part of this process as a subject that will continue this support. Just a few words about the center that we mentioned at the Prosecutor General's office. Why do we exist? What is the story of our cooperation and work with civil society? As you already know, in the ICC there is a unit working with survivors and witnesses, but we understand that the absolute majority of criminal proceedings on war crimes will be considered at the national level primarily. What we know today, I think you all heard the statistics that were presented by the Prosecutor General. We have over 120,000 criminal proceedings on war crimes. We understand that CRSV is not fully reflected in those crimes, since the survivors are not fully ready to come forward, and we understand that it will take years before there is this readiness, probably. But it is most important for the government not to obtain a confession, but rather to provide support, to provide assistance to the individual. If we speak about the role of criminal justice agencies, our center is working with those who have statuses in criminal proceedings, and we are ready to work as a bridge between those who are not sure if they're ready to engage in the criminal justice system and those who are. The entire time while the individual is working in a criminal proceeding, they will know where to get help, including this highly complicated system. Something similar to this structure exists in Croatia, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, because as you understand, even though the active phase of hostilities ended in the 90s there are still war crimes considered there. These are very long processes, and these are stories of institutional systems. When a person ends up in the criminal justice system, understands that they are not just a source of evidence, but that they are a full subject, they have agency, and they can make decisions about things that will happen to them first.
Історія про взаємодію з
The story of interaction with civil society is actually, well, I think I have the right to speak about this, but civil society became the first level of assistance and remains the first level for CRSV survivors.
кажемо, що в історії
We actually say that in the history of interaction with survivors, the CRSV cluster is the most successful one and is way ahead of the others in terms of procedures. We understand that now we have quite few cases in the general terms, because we have, again, we have 128 individuals affected by war crimes registered in the Unified Register of Pretrial Investigations. But we understand that there are so many women, men, girls, boys who are survivors of sexual violence. And we want the criminal justice system to be ready to work with them even 10 years or 15 years later, if and when that person decides to come forward and indeed take part in a criminal proceeding. What does the center do? Actually, like I said, we work with all survivors and witnesses of war crimes, because witness trauma is sometimes also something that requires assistance and support. Primarily, this is supporting individuals in criminal proceedings. What does it mean? There are no prosecutors working in the center. There are people working in the center who are civil servants, but they also have special training. They are former social workers, they are psychologists, former lawyers in the free legal aid system, particularly those who worked in aid services. They all took special training to work with different groups of survivors, take into account the requirements to avoid re-traumatizing individuals. And coordinators of the center should become this bridge between the prosecutor and the survivor, explaining, like we said, in a human language, not in legalese, what will happen in this criminal proceeding, why it is necessary. For example, there is this phrase that is unusual for people, in absentia. What does it mean? Why will a person not see the perpetrator of violence in the courtroom? How can this civil lawsuit, how can it be implemented in criminal proceedings? This is about forming an honest dialogue of what can be achieved in a criminal proceeding. And this is a story of a person having control in this criminal proceeding and making their own decisions. The second point is that this is not just a referral system, it is a referral support system, because we understand that the person needs help. A person needs understanding of what decisions they can make. That is why for us the interaction with civil society, with verified service providers is highly important. And here we are very thankful to JurFem, actually, because this is a long-standing partner of ours who get together our best colleagues under one umbrella. In addition, this is also a story about the future. This is a story of working with the International Register of Damages and what it is about and what its role can be in the reparations system. This is also a story about thinking and about legislative regulation. There are a few points here that we are currently working on. For instance, the status of children born of CRSV. We know that they should be recognized as survivors as well, according to international law, but we don't have this as part of the Ukrainian legislation, which is a challenge. Another point about support provided to witnesses of CRSV. In addition, this is also a story of access. This is something we could talk about forever. These subjects are very important. It is critically important for us to implement the informed consent concept in criminal proceeding, because this is, again, about nothing for me without me. If a person is indeed ready to receive this procedural status in the proceeding, they should understand what will be happening, what they agree to, what they consent to. They should retain their agency. Thus, in the work of our center, we already implemented the concept of informed consent. Since when a survivor agrees to work with the coordinator, we carry out the so-called primary assessment of needs. We develop a support plan, but it all starts with the informed consent point. What will be happening, why it will be happening, and the fact that an individual can refuse at any time and withdraw their consent. So this is a story of support. This is a story of a non-exclusive role. We understand that no one is wise alone. We cannot work alone, considering the number of crimes, the sheer amount of work. We all should support each other. In addition, we understand and we hope that we can expect the fastest possible deoccupation of territories. The left bank of Kherson Oblast, Zaporizhia Oblast. This is a story of a lot of work, and it is about supporting those who have already suffered, those who have learned about facts of suffering, and a story of forgetting no one, regardless of their procedural status, because this is damage caused to our country and to its people. So in this context, we are happy to work together with other stakeholders, and let's join forces. It will take us a long time. Thank you.
Veronica, rather. I think indeed you've shared that this is a lot of work that we have ahead of us, and that it is required that we have collaboration amongst national agencies, civil society, and also together with international agencies. Kim shared with us earlier how looking at intersectionality helps determine how the impacts of a crime can have, or how one crime rather can have different impacts on different groups of victims in this case, depending on their specific intersectional characteristics. Coming back to this idea that we all must work together, and outside of now determining the impact of the crime and the prosecutorial perspective, I think we want to hear today from Ihor about how, from the UN agency perspective, and specifically within the IOM, you integrate this intersectional approach when you work with survivors of CRSV, and in particular on reparations.
Well, thank you very much, JurFem, and the government of Ukraine for organizing this. Also, thank you, Dominique, for moderating this session. I will take a sort of an intersectional approach to intersectionality. I think, let me first, very briefly say why I'm going to do that. I am a philosopher by education, and I'm a practitioner of reparations for the past 20 years. I work for the International Organization for Migration, but I am also representing the team of experts of the Office of the SRSG patent here on the issue of reparations. So I will try to speak first about the concept of intersectionality, which is in the key here. And I thought that it would be useful, just to very briefly reflect from a philosophical point of view. What does it mean? The concept of intersectionality appeared in the U.S. in particularly among the scholars who are dealing with critical theory studies, etc. And the motive was to look at the different nexuses, the different linkages between race, between history, between discrimination, between gender identity, sexual identity, and so and so. And how these factors coalesce and render different groups either more vulnerable or with a greater agency to do something more, and so and so. So the concept of intersectionality, which is coming now into the language in many discourses around the world in terms of justice, in terms of criminal justice, in terms of reparative justice, and so, originated in academia, and then it was in the same time transponded gradually into the practice of many states. You asked me about the practice of states, who have had intersectional approach. And while in parallel there was a discussion and books were being written in the U.S. academia about intersectionality, in Colombia, for example, and you have heard this about this country a lot, there was a so-called differential approach in terms of identifying and designing different packages for different categories of victims. And I think this is very important to note, that the concept of intersectionality doesn't necessarily have to be exported fully or completely, but it has already its own mirrors from academic discourse into a practical model, and that would be the Colombian model. What did it mean for Colombia is that in their transitional justice and reparation policy, they tried to look at the different aspects, the different identities of the victims, either as a communities or as individuals, and design the reparation programs based on taking into consideration all these different aspects. So they had a special, and they still have a special program for Afro-Colombians, because they were targeted because of their identity as Afro-Colombians, for indigenous population. They had a different program for journalists and for human rights activists, because they were targeted because they were journalists and human rights activists. And you can imagine also that there is a point of intersectionality over there when someone is from Afro-Colombian community, and it's a journalist, and it's a human rights defender. So therefore, this aspect is very important to consider in Ukraine going forward. However, I want to add a few more things based on the experience that I have had in engaging with survivors in many different countries, because I think the notion of intersectionality or differential approach needs to be broadened beyond the issue of identity, be it either national, ethnic, or religious, or sexual, or gender identity, and to look at the different aspects. I think particularly important is taking into consideration the modalities under which the violation happened and the impact of it. And also it's important to take into consideration the lived experience of the person before the violation happened and after the violation happened. And I think all this needs to be taken into consideration if you truly want to have a sort of intersectional approach. An intersectional approach means victim-centric approach. All we are committed, at least declaratively, to victim-centric approach. So how are you going to design the program for reparation if you don't really understand the story of the victim beyond the violation itself? There is a person behind it, and there's a person with a history, there is a person with expectations, and so and so. Important aspects here, it's also to take into consideration is the temporal aspect. Temporal in terms of how distant is the moment that you engage with the survivor from the violation, from the time the violation occurred. And based on experience that I had in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Iraq, and in other places, that's also very important, because as the violation remains more distanced in the past, the attitudes of the survivors, they tend to change. So the survivor is also, as a context, it's not a monolithic concept. It's something that it can be defined in one way now, but 2 years down the road, it could be defined in a different way. And that's based on the agency of the survivors themselves. How do they position? I think this is also a very important component. The age aspect is very important. I was doing a consultation with Yazidi survivors of sexual violence and slavery under ISIS, and there was a clear gender discrepancy in terms of expectations. And the elderly victims, the elderly survivors, they were all concerned about returning to the old way of life, into the villages, in respect to the Yazidi cultural norms, etc. The younger ones, they were particularly interested actually in pursuing their individual dreams and their individual expectations, etc. So the age aspect is also very important to be taken into consideration, in addition to the gender, in addition to the sexual orientation, in addition to the age. These are all factors that needs to be taken in consideration when designing and planning engagement with survivor. And this engagement cannot happen only once. It's a continuous engagement that needs to happen throughout the implementation of the program, just because I mentioned that the attitudes of the survivors and the needs, they change over time. Some of them, they might simply very quickly overcome what they have suffered, and they might have a more agency, and some of them will have less agency. An experience from Bosnia and Herzegovina is that, for example, one of the ladies that I was interviewing, who was a survivor of sexual violence 30 years ago, did not have any interest in receiving personally any reparation. But she was talking about how her situation impacted the life of her daughter, who was not able to attend studies. So her expectations in terms of reparation is that the state provides a reparation in form of education and support for her daughter. So just to round it up, I think the issue of intersectionality and differential approach is extremely important going forward. It goes beyond the issue of identities. It goes into the issue of lived experience of the survivor and the victim. And it needs to be, it also has a temporal aspect in the sense that over the time, as the time progresses, the views and the needs of survivors, they need to change. So there is a need of a constant engagement with the survivors. So thank you very much. I will stop here. I hope it was good.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much, Igor. And I think you have said something, thank you. Yeah, let's give him a round of applause. You've said something really quite crucial to this panel in particular, that adopting an intersectional approach ultimately is adopting a victim/survivor-centered approach. And that this is not a static concept. It's not something we do once, but rather something that's constantly evolving. And I think this is the overall challenge of this conference today that we're in. And with that, I'll give it to Viktoriia, who will continue.
Дякую велике. Насправді,
Thank you very much. I actually also want to emphasize that the key aspect of intersectionality is probably understanding of how different we all are and how all these differences provide for different consequences for trauma lived. It all affects whether the programs and services we provide to survivors will be effective. On the one hand, the survivors are the final beneficiaries of services we provide, but without engaging them, without understanding that we are all different and that our needs are different, we cannot speak of efficiency at all. And in connection with this, Alexei, I will have a question to you, and I will be thankful if you could share your experience as part of the network of men who survived sexual violence. Why is it important to take into account the experience of men who survived violence, especially considering what we just heard from Igor, understanding that all these peculiarities affect the final programs developed for survivors? In addition to this, it will be very interesting to hear your thoughts about statements just made. I think that when we have public consultations with survivors, with civil society, we reduce stigma in society and we actually form a much better climate so that survivors would be more engaged in this. Over to you, please.
Вітаю всіх.
Hello, everyone. I would like to have a conversation with the guys after the meeting. I would like to thank everyone for the opportunity to speak here on behalf of men who survived violence, including CRSV. This is all very new for me. It will be difficult for me to speak, so I will read a little bit. I am thankful to Dr. Mukwege Foundation for assistance and support understanding our needs, and other foundations that understand our needs and take them into account. One of the principles of Dr. Mukwege's foundation is nothing for us without us, that is, take into account our needs and our wishes rather than the vision of this help by individuals who don't understand what we lived and what difficulties we may face. Different foundations and organizations often violate the principle of do no harm, and I want to point this out a lot. I heard multiple times from graduates of the so-called Russian World School, what can they know about my needs? I apologize. What can they know about what I went through? What can they know about my problems? And I heard this from multiple men. That's why their engagement will improve the awareness of the needs of survivors. Engagement of survivors will help to reduce traumatization when they are assisted. It will also reduce stigmatization and will help overcome trauma when they see that their opinion is important and that people take it into account. And it's also crucial that interaction with survivors shouldn't be just formal, just on paper. Otherwise, it just levels every possible positive effect. It is also necessary to take into account the new reality of Russia constantly using torture, including sexual torture, which affects multiple men and women. Assistance to affected men, even if provided, does not take into account the specific needs of survivors themselves, or it is incomplete. For example, there is the issue of the so-called reproductive health. The Andreev Family Foundation really helped us with this, so thank you very much. There is also a big problem with the lack of information about programs for survivors, information about those programs. When a person is liberated from captivity, they are very disoriented for a while. And it seems crucial that survivors should obtain information as structurally and as quickly as possible so that there is no further trauma suffered. Also, most survivors encounter issues while obtaining various documents from various agencies. They are insensitive, they are slow, and this leads the person to isolate and to be unwilling to engage further. We also shouldn't forget about those who are currently in captivity. We shouldn't forget about those who are suffering violence right at this moment. We are laying the groundwork for assistance to them in the future, for their adaptation, integration into society, so that people wouldn't have to encounter difficulties that we are encountering today. We also shouldn't forget the indirect effect of such work with survivors, namely prevention of domestic violence. A traumatized person without due help can further traumatize their loved ones. So if there is no work with traumatized men, this will also increase the number of issues that we are facing. There are a lot of subjects that we need to discuss in terms of this, and every problem requires its own solutions. We are ready for dialogue, we are ready for cooperation, and we are ready for interaction. We are uniting already, we are helping each other, women and men. It would be great if others could help us as well, or at least for them to understand our needs and take them into account. We need to unite, we need to coordinate efforts to create a comprehensive aid mechanism so that we don't waste our resources and efforts. Thank you. Actually, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, for sharing your experience at network. And it's so valuable that you are here today and that you are sharing the nature of your work. Again, everything what we are doing should not be just formal on paper, just like you said. It should actually take into account your experience. We know that men often suffer the form of CRSV, such as sexualized torture, and there are legal aid requirements, there are psychological requirements, but also there are, in addition to health issues, there are problems with paperwork. Yeah, there is a problem with receiving documents. Yes, you're right, by survivors or others. So thank you very much, Alexei. I think you can guess that my next question will be because we have another organization with us, All Survivors Project, and it is an organization ensuring assistance to boys and men. We would be thankful if you could share the experience of the organization for assisting boys and men. How do you develop your own initiatives? How do you disseminate them? I know that you are doing this on the national and on the regional level, so please do share.
Is it on? Can you hear me? Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you very much, JurFem, for inviting us here. Before I speak about our work at All Survivors Project, I'd just like to acknowledge the bravery of survivors and survivor organizations who are here with us today. Thank you so much, Alexei, for all that you're doing. We are so grateful to you, and we salute your bravery. Thank you very much. Before I proceed, my name is Charu Hogg. I'm the founder director of All Survivors Project, and I'd like to share something personal with you. You know, why am I, as a cisgendered heterosexual woman, leading an organization that works on sexual violence against men and boys? And the personal story is that I used to be a researcher with Human Rights Watch, and I would best describe myself as a human rights researcher and an advocate. And it was on the course of my work with Human Rights Watch that I did a piece of research for them documenting violations, including sexual violence, that men and women had suffered in the context of deprivation of liberty in Sri Lanka during the final stages of the conflict. I interviewed about 100 people, of which 33 were men, and the 33 men disclosed to me about the kind of sexual violence and sexualized torture they had suffered. I say it with a lot of humility, embarrassment, and shame that I had no idea about this violation and the way it is perpetrated before I had this very direct experience. I had no training. At human rights organizations at that time did not really put in referral pathways in place. And I think the experience must have been Not a very good one for the victims, but it was certainly a very damaging one for me personally. And that was the starting point of my understanding and reading more on male vulnerability, male victimization, how male rape is understood in international human rights law and humanitarian law. And that was the beginning of a journey. And this journey, we have now completed 7 years of leading. I'm All Survivors Project is 7 years old. And the question often gets put to me, why men and boys? Why does it matter? Why do you work on them? So the first thing I would say is that for All Survivors Project, we are a feminist organization. We follow an intersectional gendered approach to this work. We certainly want our work to be complementary to the work that is happening by women's and girls' rights organizations. So we want to, through our efforts, include the entire universe of survivors who may be excluded. So that's the first point. And why do men matter? Because if you exclude men and boys, as Alexei just pointed out, you do not address trauma within communities, which has a deep, lasting and debilitating impact in the healing of communities and society in the future. It has an impact on the individual, it has an impact on the family, and it has an impact on communities. So I think the question that was put to me was, how do you follow a survivor-centered approach in your work? So I think it's very important to understand, to really put yourself in the shoes of a victim and a survivor. And there are many learnings that have come to us in this process. We work directly with hundreds of victims in Colombia, male victims, including men of diverse sexual orientation and gender identity. We work with them in their access to health services, in organizing psychosocial support for them, organizing relocation and protection for them, and in also representing them in the transitional justice process. So the first thing is really that it is not a one-size-fits-all approach. So what is true for male victims in Colombia is not true for male victims in Central African Republic and will not be true for male victims in Afghanistan. We found, for example, the victims that we work with in Afghanistan did not even want to talk about their victimization. So the only way that they could engage with the actual violence that happened with them and share their stories with us was through a vignette approach. So it was a hypothetical case. Okay, X was a young boy who was walking to his school. He was called in by an armed guard and he was abused. So he did this. What do you think about it? That was the only way they could engage because the trauma was so huge and the risks of admitting to sexual violence really brought a whole risk of being somebody who had diverse sexual orientation and gender identity, which is criminalized in Afghanistan. So in Colombia, and that brings me to the point that Kim raised and was raised previously about this terminology issue about victims and survivors. All the men that we work with in Colombia define themselves as victims. And they say, do not call us survivors because we haven't survived this. This victimhood continues with us every day of our lives. So we want to be seen as victims. And the other aspect, of course, is the legal aspect, which Kim pointed out too, which is, the recognition of victims in law in Colombia is a very special one. And as Igor pointed out, it is a differentiated approach. It does recognize, the fact that victims and survivors have suffered because of their diverse intersectional experiences, and this needs to be recognized in law. So I suppose the issue is you cannot judge a situation till you really work very closely with victim survivors, allow them to define what matters to them, and give them the safe spaces, the appropriate and ethical approaches. For us, it's so integral in our work now that we will not speak with a victim unless there's psychosocial support at hand, and not just the one-off session where, you know, for 2 hours the person gets psychological first aid. This is a hugely traumatic experience, I mean, as all of us know and understand, but I think it is doubly problematic for men because of the way it intersects with universally held gender norms. The fact that men consider themselves, you know, strong, inviolable, and then this happens, and the way society interacts with this concept. So I think it is really the long-term psychosocial care and recovery is an integral part of this. We do this, the victims and survivors we work with, we ensure that we put this in place. A lot of times we have to put in resources which are our own because, as you know, the world of funding and donor interest is limited all over. And the second way we do this is in direct partnership with referrals. So for example, in Central African Republic, our partner is Médecins Sans Frontières with MSF. So we ensure that, you know, there is, not only do the victims complete a cycle of care with MSF, but they always have a place to go to, a safe, ethical medical service provider. In Afghanistan, we work with a medical service provider, and they are the ones who ensure that the victims always have a safe place to go to and receive the care that they need. I had a very scripted sort of presentation, but I think I want to do justice to the way this session is evolving and really share very personal experiences. It's very new for us in Ukraine. We're learning from our partners, JurFem, and from all of you. And as has been the request before, let's work together to address this very abominable crime. Thank you.
Дякую велике.
Thank you very much, Ru. And I want to point out that we are also learning, we are starting to understand how to take into account the experience of survivors, how to do it effectively, how to do it in time. And I'm supporting your idea that organizations that work with survivors, with victims, are absolutely incredible. I am in awe of their bravery. I am in awe of their initiativeness that they show. And Olana, it will be very useful if you could share the experience of SEMA Ukraine, and especially maybe you could share how you envision the participation of survivors in these processes that we are discussing, the drafting of policies, creation of government programs, creation of services, and in particular, because this is also something that Alexei pointed out, how this affects the establishment of these stereotypical ideas and stigmatization. In the art part that started our day, the last phrase that was on the screen was that we are not guilty. It is not our fault. How do you think the voice of survivors reduces victim blaming? What trends do you see, and what do you want to happen? Thank you. Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to thank all the organizations and all the organizers for being present here. I am very nervous because this is the first time that I am a speaker at such a conference with such a large international representation, with international foundations. I'm slightly nervous, I'm sorry. I would like to say first that I am a representative of SEMA Ukraine, which is an organization that has existed in Ukraine since 2019, and originally it united women who were affected by torture and captivity in the east of Ukraine. So when they say conflict in the east of Ukraine, I cannot quite agree. This is a war. that has been ongoing since 2014, the war that has been going on for 10 years now. So the first victims were since 2014. We are part of the global SEMA network, which was established with the help of Dr. Mukwege's foundation. And in Ukraine, we have been working since 2019. First, we united. Indeed, we were like 10 to 12 women who decided to fight for their rights. We decided to speak up about what happened to us. And back then, it was very difficult. The war was somewhere far in the east, maybe in Crimea, but there was no war in Crimea, essentially. And speaking of what happened to us, well, nobody wanted to hear it. I also want to draw this example. In 2021, our organization, together with Dr. Mukwege Foundation, organized a round table where we invited journalists, where we invited representatives of our defense and security agency representatives. Unfortunately, not everyone participated, but thanks to the round table, we drew attention to this program, to this problem, that there is conflict-related sexual violence. There are people affected by this conflict. They are victims in legal language, yes, but we don't think we are victims. We don't call ourselves that. Based on this round table, we were able to ensure that prosecutor's office first started opening criminal investigations and taking testimony from people who were affected by CRSV. They surveyed about 10 of our members, and now that the prosecutor's office says they have testimony from 274 individuals who agreed to do this, I have a question. Is the testimony we provided on this list? We were the first one, so we are curious whether our testimony is there or not. Maybe you don't consider it. I wanted to be fast. Sorry, and I lost my train of thought. Maybe you don't think our testimony is important because it was before the full-scale invasion. I'm sorry. Last year in May, there was an event organized by the Prosecutor General's office, which was called Respect, Support, Justice. Among other things, well, this event was organized in a very interesting way. There were questions discussed at a specific table, then we switched tables, we discussed other issues. And among other things, there was a discussion of a draft law on interim reparations. And at that event, there were about 60 different organizations. This included civil society, human rights unions, representatives of prosecution, the police, the security service. This was about 150 people. But among these 150 people, there were only 3 survivors, including me. Only 3 of them. This was last year when there was a full-scale invasion, when people already knew about the Bucha, when there were already a lot of liberated territories with evidence of crimes committed by Russians. But again, they didn't want to hear us a lot. And when we were discussing a possible memorandum of cooperation with our organization, SEMA Ukraine, so that we could help, we could survey survivors. We could explain what questions were acceptable and what were not acceptable at all. There was enthusiasm about this, but it's been almost a year since then, and this memorandum is still not there. This is about negative aspects, I guess, but these are just work moments. These are challenges, yes. I just wanted to also say that when there is a question of should we engage survivors in the discussion of all issues and in the discussion of documents, strategies that are aimed at improving our lives, this is a very rhetorical issue for me. Yes, indeed, it is important, because finally our society is turning to face us. It stops just working instead of us, making decisions for us, without us. No one will explain things better than a survivor. A survivor is the best expert at what they need. And when we speak about reparations or something like that, this shouldn't be just about monetary compensation of some kind. Of course, money is good, and money can resolve some problems partially. But money cannot resolve all issues. A person needs recognition. They need to avoid having to explain herself or himself over and over again. They need to be listened to. They need to be understood. This is one point. Another issue is, I understand that Ukraine is now facing an unprecedented level of challenges. We didn't have things like that before the war. We didn't understand something like this may happen. So, of course, we are learning based on our mistakes. We are learning from the experience of other countries. There are foundations and organizations helping us with it, including Dr. Mukwege Foundation and the Global Survivor Foundation. We are basing it on their experience. We're trying to learn from them. And to sum up, I want to emphasize that, yes, victim is a legal term. In the legal understanding, we are victims, but we don't consider ourselves victims. We survived. We are fighters, and we are fighting. And if you want to help us, stand side by side with us. Don't do it for us. Let's do it with us. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the support that you provide to all of us and to Women United by SEMA today. Thank you for emphasizing that the crimes were taking place since 2014. I will make one organizational remark. Based on the noise from the hallway, you can understand that some clusters are already done. I hope that you don't mind staying a bit longer. You want to add a bit, right? Yes, I want to add that the work that we will now do together, all legal organizations, all human rights organizations are involving survivors in their work. It's very good, and it's also very good because, unfortunately, there are still people in captivity. Ukrainians are still held captive in the territories that were occupied long ago, Donetsk, Luhansk Oblast. I hope they will be deoccupied at some point, and we will bring back our people who are still there in Russian torture chambers. And I hope by the time they come back, we will have a specific mechanism and specific work and some specific things that we can offer to them. When a person is there. Thank you. Thank you for mentioning the informed consent. Thank you for mentioning the importance of engaging survivors. Let's be very brief, up to a minute. Veronica. Thank you. I actually just, I will have this point of a memorandum. We were still not ready at that point, but we will be ready now. This is about a broader engagement. It's very good that support of survivors have had to exist since 2014. We are speaking about a very large number of survivors that we have since the start of the full-scale invasion. But we shouldn't exclude those survivors who have been in the temporarily occupied territories since 2014, who don't have access to justice. As for testimony, I cannot say anything because we are not the prosecutorial side. I would say that no testimony can be and may be lost because every interview, every conversation has to lead somewhere, not just on paper, not just for reporting purposes, but to lead us to a real result, either in the justice system or in organizing our further work. Thank you. Thank you. Maybe there are questions from the audience. I see a hand. Our colleague will give you the mic. Hello, Tatiana Baeva, head of Khmelnytsky organization. And I have a question to Uliana. Uliana, I am from Khmelnytsky Oblast. As far as I understand, the Ministry of Social Policy is responsible for shelters for women who were affected by gender-based violence. How comes that Khmelnytsky Oblast, that is third in terms of accommodating IDP women, I think those include women who were affected by CRSV, don't have a single shelter where a woman can stay for a while? There was this outrageous case, I think, when a woman who is HIV positive, who is a survivor of CRSV, she was turned down from a shelter and we had to send her to a different area. Don't look at the department website because we conducted monitoring. We can tell you a different situation, a real situation. Thank you. Thank you for your question. Yes, indeed, the Minister of Social Policy is responsible for supporting survivors of domestic violence and CRSV. In December 2020, we actually amended the cabinet resolution in order to expand the powers of our specialized services and to add the opportunity for them to work with CRSV survivors. But we maintained the article in the state budget, which is the state subvention for the establishment of specialized services to respond to domestic violence. And Khmelnytsky Oblast, over the period when I worked, starting from August 2022, Khmelnytsky Oblast did receive government funds to establish specialized services. That is why I am absolutely ready to tell you what specialized services we are speaking of, because we insisted. We spoke a lot about engagement of target groups. we insisted that every oblast administration, while selecting what specialized service is needed, should consult with NGOs, with local self-government, with designated women's organizations. So it is very important that every stakeholder should be involved in decision-making. For example, now in 2024, we also have 20 million hryvnias in the state budget to create specialized services, and we will be making very special emphasis on the creation of mobile brigades because they showed their effectiveness during the full-scale invasion, during the occupation of territories, gradual deoccupation, a large number of people who have now relocated to safer areas, and this is crucial. So, reinforcing the national violence response system is an important priority, and we are very open to working together. Thank you. Thank you very much. Our colleagues and us are still remaining in this space, and we will be able to follow up with our discussion at lunch. As a co-moderator, Dominique and I, we will allow the audience to ask one more question before lunch, and I saw your hand first. Colleague, please. Hello, everyone. I am a journalist from Liganet, and my question is primarily to Veronika, but also maybe other speakers have something to add. Recently, Medusa, a Russian media outlet, published an article that representatives of the Russian Red Cross actually torture Ukrainian prisoners of war. Have you heard of this story? Are you working on this? Have you contacted the ICRC? I will just specify that we just have 1 minute left, so thank you for your question. This is more about prosecutors working on war crimes. My unit doesn't work on documenting. I just want to say that monitoring of all news websites, all information sources about potential violations is carried out. As for responding to this, I think it would be best to ask the head of our specialized unit, Anna Sosonska. She's at a different cluster now, so I can just put you in touch with her. Thank you. Another comment. Well, a question about the signing of memorandum. Will it be with SEMA or with all organizations? I am just interested in the men issue. And I am also interested in Khmelnytsky Oblast. Is something being done for men? Could I please ask, as a moderator, to please move the discussion about Khmelnytsky Oblast to the lunch break, because we actually started questions about the situation that currently exists. As for the memorandum, yeah, I actually think that such events are also valuable because you can get direct information. In general, the story of cooperation with the communities of survivors is one of top 3 stories. All issues about such things, I think it is much faster to discuss it directly rather than through official correspondence, because, again, it is survivors who must talk about survivors. It shouldn't be us who comes up with something on their behalf. Survivors know best. What do you need? Yeah. Thank you. To sum up, I want to wish us all a successful dialogue. And Dominique, over to you for some final words.
Thank you, Viktoriia, and thank you to all the panelists today. I think that the discussion has been really, really rich, to say the least. And I extremely appreciate the participation and the presentations from the part of Olena and Alexei. I think we've hit at the core of what the message of today's panel and what the message of today's conference is, which is the importance of a survivor-centered approach and the huge impact that listening to survivors, first and foremost, can have on the quality of our policies and programs, be them about reparations, care, or just about overall response to conflict-related sexual violence. I know we have lots more questions probably that have come out. I myself have some, but I think we will take it to the lunch break, and thank you so much.